Witchcraft, Resistance and Masculinity in the Tragedy of Sophonisba. So Margaret Murray debates the notion of witchcraft as a subversive movement, and Clark further proposes that witchcraft may even be one of the most extreme examples of oppositionalism in Western culture. Therefore, when the witch appears as a figure in popular media, they are automatically the convergence point for the subversion of patriarchal norms. This is relevant in early modern England, where the discourse that regulated the woman became increasingly interchangeable with the paradigms that were applied to condemn witches. So it became increasingly plausible for any woman to be accused of being a witch, which meant it was also possible for any woman to access this subversive craft. This model is apparent in early modern tragedies. Looking at the traditionally masculine theme of rape, I propose that witchcraft is introduced as an instrument for male domination, but instinctively assimilates into the plot as a means for feminine resistance. I'm also going to give a content warning that I will be discussing rape, the rape of both women and men. I am conscious that it's a delicate subject, and this discussion stays within the context of the early modern period. So to begin with witchcraft, the early modern English witch became the antithesis of the home, of the wife, the mother, and the harmony of the domestic sphere. This was because the early modern woman was governed by gendered structures that sought to regulate the female body as the inferior derivative of the male. Particularly due to their reproductive capabilities, women were seen as more open, more grotesque, and less autonomous, and were primarily defined by the social function to bear children and guide the house. This impacted each station that a woman could occupy in society. The maiden, the wife, the mother, the grandmother, and the widow were all defined around the understanding that women were made to be mothers. If a woman opposed this designation, she became a complete negation of the ruling norm. She would become something other, a perversion of the normative woman in the form of a witch. This is apparent with Elizabeth Frances. She was indicted for witchcraft in 1566 and confessed to inheriting witchcraft from her grandmother, which upsets traditional mother-daughter relationships and creates an anxiety around the maternal figure. She further confesses to murdering a lover, aborting a child, and killing her second child with witchcraft. This highlights the witch's perverse femininity and isolates her as a threat to the private authority of women who conformed to the prescribed gender roles. This feminized threat is exacerbated by the body-based evidence of English witchcraft, particularly the witch's mark. This was a body orifice that was used by witches to feed blood to their familiars, which was an animal companion. And as you can see up on the screen, that cast was Elizabeth Frances's familiar, and it was a white cast that she named Satan. Yeah, very creative. And by 1579, many English judges considered the witch's mark as the most important evidence for the persecution of witches. And while such marks were found on men indicted for witchcraft, the action imitates a mother breastfeeding her babe. This specified a biological function unique to the female body as one of the primary legally admissible characteristics of witchcraft. This body-based evidence widened the paradigms of witch-identifying traits so that any woman could be a witch, and simultaneously any woman could access witchcraft. This model is realised in early modern tragedies because men treat witches as anomalous agents of power, something unnatural and beyond their jurisdiction. Think of Macbeth's weird sisters. While the women can lexically, symbolically, and sometimes physically interact with the witches. Moreover, in the tragedy of Sophonisba, the woman becomes interchangeable with the witch to gain control of the masculine theme of rape. So in Marston's The Tragedy of Sophonisba, it follows a noble woman called Sophonisba and her fiancé Massinissa. Their wedding night is interrupted by the Second Punic War before they can consummate their marriage. Massinissa is deployed to fight Rome, and this leaves Sophonisba in a liminal state as a virgin wife and a married maiden. Then Syphax, the unsuccessful rival of Sophonisba's affection, takes advantage of the unconsummated marriage to arrange a political union with Sophonisba. This catalyses an intense conflict between Sophonisba and Syphax, as Syphax repeatedly attempts to complete their union through manipulation, rape, necrophilia, and witchcraft. And what we find is that the final attempted assault, which is the one that incorporates witchcraft, challenges the masculine dominance of the act because Syphax is raped. So to touch on rape in the early modern legal system, rape was paradoxically a crime committed against women that did not define the woman as an autonomous victim. This was because the law stemmed from a 13th century statute that defined rape as harm to or abduction of male property. 16th century legislation shifted this definition to crime against the person, and consent became central. However, this was in a system that sexualized and marginalized the female voice. So, as Pilates surmises, the victim must not only refuse consent to her assailant, but also make her refusal unambiguously evident to an audience that prioritized the male narrative. And there was also a tradition for rape in early modern tragedies, where the victim commits suicide or they are murdered. This serves a multitude of purposes. It implies that the shame of rape was unsurvivable, and it reconciles the conflicting identities that rape victims embodied. They were compromised virgins, unchaste maidens, and unloyal wives, and suicide is presented as a way to resolve these identities. Therefore, rape was a plot device that offered an automatic, dramatic, and tragic resolution for play. Dave Nicole notes that the only diversions from this tradition are in a few tragicomedies, where the victim marries the rapist. This preserves a form of chastity by restricting the number of her sexual partners to one. However, this possible solution made rape a tactic for men who wanted to marry a certain woman but had been refused, and in many cases it made rape an instrument of social climbing and class mobility for men. The fact that this alternative solution was reserved for tragicomedies reflects a ridicule that was attached to this process. It wasn't a serious solution, but it also doesn't take the victim seriously, because it further entraps them within the control of their rapist, who is now their husband. So we see that the tragedy of Sophonisba needs to navigate three complex sets of conventions: those of witchcraft, the legal understandings of rape, and the artistic traditions of rape. Applying these contemporary conventions to the tragedy of Sophonisba, it is clear that Sophonisba is in a precarious position. Legally, she is already Syphax's fiancée, so it would not be admissible for her to accuse him of abducting her to orchestrate a forced marriage. And if he does succeed in raping her, she cannot accuse him of destroying her virginity, because in the eyes of the state, it already belongs to him. Therefore, the theme of rape is a private conflict between Sophonisba and Syphax, where the primary consequence is Sophonisba's autonomy. This immense threat is clear in Act 3, Scene 1, where Syphax, his dagger twined about her hair, drags in Sophonisba in her nightgown petticoats. This stage direction personifies the rape trope. Syphax's dagger is at risk of cutting her hair, and as we know, hair is often exchanged as a token of affection, and Syphax is threatening to forcibly take this affection, which is a preemptive illusion of his willingness to rape Sophonisba. Syphax also has an inclination for necrophilia. Later in the play, Sophonisba gives him an ultimatum that she would rather commit suicide than consummate their marriage, and Syphax counters, "Do, strike thy breast, no being dead, I'll use with highest lust of sense thy senseless flesh." This assault would negate any autonomy that Sophonisba has fashioned for herself, as she is relegated to a symbol of Syphax's masculinity. Particularly as this exertion of masculinity would be immortalized through her dead body, Sophonisba is contending with Syphax's agenda to cement his dominance in history through the conquest of her body. While the conflict between Sophonisba and Syphax escalates, witchcraft is introduced in what Adrian Blaumeier calls one of the era's most sensational scenes of the uncanny. This scene establishes the witch as an instrument of masculinity, because Syphax has decided, since heaven helps not, deepest hell we'll try. He seeks out Erichtho, the witch, to force Sophonisba's passion. Now, Erichtho is based on Lucan's Pharsalia and has been adapted only 3 times, in Dante's Inferno in this play, and in Goethe's Faust. Apologies if I pronounced his name wrong. So this is topical to Marston's adaptation because Syphax characterizes her as a relic of ancient times. She lives in a desert of forsaken graves and tombs, the ghost forced out she joys to inhabit. And comparing this to the excerpt from Lucan's Pharsalia, Marston's Erichtho is a near replication of the original, as if she is an apparition of the historical verses that she originates from. And this reference to her origins is central in understanding her connection to Sophonisba, because Erichtho is historically an assaulter of men. In Lucan's Pharsalia, she reanimates a dead soldier's body and uses it as a vessel for her prophecy. Similarly, in Dante's Inferno, she is a soul-stealing witch who forces Virgil to fetch a soul for her. Therefore, Erichtho, by her very nature, is not just a subversion of feminine norms, but an active dominator of men. Knowing this characterization and seeing that Marston has embedded her history in the drama, we can assume that she'll resist Syphax's pursuit of Sophonisba, and we should not be surprised that Erichtho actually violates Syphax. Some argue that this action affirms the deceitful and sexual nature that was assumed to be integral to women by the Jacobean audience, and Selig proposes that it addresses the contemporary taste for a misogynistic interpretation of the witch. However, I propose that by subverting the masculine traditions of rape, witchcraft is an accessory of feminine resistance to misogyny. Unlike his predecessors, Marston's Sophonisba is characterized by her moral code. When Massinissa is deployed to fight Rome, she demands that he make me proud to be a soldier's wife. My fortunes may be wretched, but not I. Here she prioritizes duty over her own security. She is patriotic, sacrificing, and virtuous, the ideal woman, and David Schmidt suggests that she represents an idealized, perhaps even nostalgic notion of virtue and honor in politics. Taking this into account, Sophonisba would not publicly or physically challenge Syphax. Instead, she employs language and illusions, particularly bed tricks, to circumvent Syphax's attempted assaults, as she chooses to manipulate the scene rather than directly fight him. It will become apparent that Erichtho also employs the same tactics to sabotage Syphax. Therefore, despite their differences, they become 2 facets of the same symbolic woman, each responding to Syphax's actions, one through natural means of resistance and the other through unconventional power. In this way, the conflict orchestrated by Syphax binds their identities together and reveals how social and antisocial forms of femininity can resist the tragedy structure. In order to understand Sophonisba and Erichtho's connection, we need to compare their bedchamber scenes. So there are 3 bedchamber scenes in the play. The first is Sophonisba and Massinissa's interrupted wedding night. It introduces their relationship as one of love and desire. However, the moment is penetrated by outside conflict. It leaves the purest relationship of the play unresolved and preempts the influx of intrusive masculine conflict into Sophonisba's bedchamber. The second bedchamber scene is between Sophonisba and Syphax, and it begins with the stage direction of Syphax dragging Sophonisba by her hair. When he contemplates the advantages of rape, Sophonisba mollifies the situation and employs reassurances such as "I am thy servant now" to affirm Syphax's possession of her without the necessity of sex. Then, keying into her identity as the figure of morality, she confesses that she made a vow to make a private sacrifice before she touched a second spouse. When Syphax gives her the privacy to fulfill this vow, we discover that the sacrifice is actually Syphax's slave, Van Gogh, as Sophonisba stages a bedchamber scene around him. Sophonisba drugs Van Gogh with opium, lays him on Syphax's bed, and draws the curtains around him. This creates an illusion of Syphax's bride. Sophonisba claims authority over the bedchamber by manipulating the lexical and symbolic functions tied to her identity as the moral woman. This subverts Syphax's power and the audience's expectation of the rape. She violates Syphax's expectations, his dominance, and his social status by placing a slave in his bed. In creating illusions to oppose Syphax, the ambiguous definitions separating woman from witch become realized because Sophonisba invokes the witch's antisocial form of femininity in her resistance. So the third and final bedchamber scene is between Syphax and Erichtho, and it is the rape scene of the play. It is also the moment where the physical boundaries between Erichtho and Sophonisba become ambiguous. While Erichtho agrees to force Sophonisba's passion, she, like Sophonisba, fashions a fake bedchamber scene to oppose Syphax. Erichtho explains that a charm will force Sophonisba to his bed, but he must not speak to her. This is framed as though any interaction beyond sex will disrupt the charm and free Sophonisba. So Erichtho is the orchestrator of the scene. She is granting Syphax his desire and seemingly revoking Sophonisba's autonomy. This would fulfill her purpose as an instrument of masculine dominance. However, that is not the case because she transforms into Sophonisba and rapes Syphax, de-aging herself through their union. She does not just challenge the standards of rape, but imposes those traditions back onto the man who was violated and used for her gain. Additionally, in this moment, because Erichtho's witchcraft has physically manifested as Sophonisba, both women amalgamate into one form, the woman and the witch becoming interchangeable in their resistance. This is a clear inversion of traditional rape scenes because the man has been violated, and while it may not be brutal, the manipulation of language and setting conforms to the feminine mode of resistance that is employed in the play. Erichtho and Sophonisba's convergence underscores the play's exploration of power and domination and makes female resistance an aspect of these themes in the tragedy. So, to conclude, the theme of rape had an established tradition in early modern tragedies, where the rape victim committed suicide to reconcile the social anxieties that were projected onto their identity. This model focuses the resolution of social norms onto the female body, and her destruction absolves the male destroyer. According to this tradition, Syphax should succeed in exerting his masculinity over Sophonisba at the cost of her body, her marital freedom, and her life. However, Marston introduces an unstable element to this tradition with witchcraft. It intrinsically opposes social norms and inverts the social standards that are projected onto women. Moreover, the witch that he adapted canonically opposes men. Therefore, in this play, witchcraft is a literary device that naturally resists the traditions of rape. It assimilates the resistance of the woman and the witch into a singular being and projects the violation back onto the male destroyer, which completely reimagines the masculine traditions of rape in early modern tragedy. Thank you for listening, and I would appreciate any questions or points that people have, as I'm still in the early stages of my research.